In this segment, I'm going to be discussing minority rights, one of the key principles of America's constitutional democracy. In the last segment, I discussed majority rule, and you really should look at the majority rule video and the reading attached to the majority rule video before watching this particular segment. Both of the segments are vitally important. America's constitutional democratic system depends on the principle of majority rule and minority rights. But the two principles are contradictory. The more that we rely on majority rule, the fewer minority rights there are. And the more we insist that we have to have a minority right for this and a minority right for that, the more we elevate minority rights, the less there is to decide by majority rule. So why have two contradictory principles? Well, we have two contradictory principles because of the origin of government itself. We view government as being necessary in order to protect us from random violence, either from our immediate neighbors or perhaps even our family, certainly from outside groups that might attack us. So we want to create a government that will have the resources that can protect us. But that government protects us by being coercive, by threatening to use violence against those who disrupt social order with violence. And in order to do that, we give government a legal monopoly on the use of lethal force. Well, that raises a question. We've created government to stop violence. But what if the government itself becomes violent? What if it uses its legal monopoly of lethal force against us improperly? So we have to have a way of regulating government. And that brings us to the issue of minority rights. If we were concerned only with protecting from random violence and were unconcerned about the damage that government might do to us, we could rely on majority rule. We'd simply say, every time you get 50% plus one, the 50% plus one have absolute authority over everybody else. That's not what our government is based on. Indeed, you might ask, well, if we're trying to protect minority rights, the individual right of each of us to be self-preserved, why have majority rule at all? Or in what sense do we have majority rule at all? And so we come to this proposition that I discussed last time, which is America's constitutional democracy depends on majority rule, and we rely on majority rule in one fundamental sense. The majority of the American people support the United States Constitution and have almost entirely for the last 230 years. We insist, in the words of the Constitution, that every one of our elected officials will swear an oath to uphold that Constitution, making the Constitution higher than any elected official at all. A majority support the Constitution. But the Constitution that they support has all kinds of provisions in it that protect minority rights. So the majority that supports the Constitution has voluntarily tied their hands in certain cases in order to protect minority rights. Why protect minority rights? We protect minority rights in order to prevent violence. If we had majority rule, and if the majority was a narrow 50% plus one of all of the people in the country, and they sought to impose their will on the 49% who didn't constitute a minority, the group is so evenly divided that the 49% would surely fight back. And what would we get? We'd get more blood on the floor we'd have to clean up. We wouldn't promote the nonviolence that is the essence of what government means to do. So we need minority rights just as we need majority rule in our constitutional system. How can we make these two matters work? Well, the first thing we have to do is address a serious misconception that you can find in the newspapers, the magazines, on television, on the internet, and even announced by some politicians. That's the use of the word minority to refer only to ethnic groups or religious groups or sexual preference groups or gender groups, whatever, that they are minorities, as if being a group was what was required. That's not at all the meaning. The meaning of the word minority, in a dictionary kind of sense, is simply any time when a vote is taken and one group falls short of 50% plus one. They're a minority. They're a minority on that question. It is true that there are fewer than 50% of the American people who have dark skin, dark pigment. Yeah, but that, of course, is almost meaningless in terms of of the biological character of those people. We're all really one race. Similarly, there's a minority of people who speak Spanish. Well, okay, but there's no reason to define them as a minority. And we've now even found the word minority used to describe women, except the problem with that is there are more women than men in the country. And they only like to use the word minority to describe women because it's minority of elected officials. There's no way to go with using minority to describe specific groups. The only way, and the only way that I use the term minority, is to describe any vote in which fewer than 50% plus one are aligned on a particular question. That is the true meaning of minority, and that's the sense in which I'm using it here, and that's the sense in which it has historically been used to describe the Constitution. So, what are we doing here? Well, we are establishing that a majority of the people support the Constitution. And a number of provisions in the Constitution do give majorities the authority to decide questions. So a law is passed in both houses of Congress by a majority vote of those people who were present and voting on the vote. If they pass it in identical form, it goes to the president. If he signs it, it becomes a law. Majority rule prevails. We have elections. In our country, though, we don't really rely on majority rule. We rely on something called plurality, which is not a majority, and which, in some cases, could turn out to be a minority vote. But majority rule is used for most things. Where is it not used? Minority rights under the Constitution are most often described as those rights that are so important that a majority has to have a supermajority in order to prevail. So, we make a requirement that in passing a law, while 50% plus one will pass the law in the first place, if a president vetoes it, we demand a supermajority or a two-thirds majority to pass it over his veto. If we're trying to approve a treaty between the United States and another country, the president can negotiate it, but it still has to have the advice and consent of the Senate in order to be ratified, and that takes a two-thirds vote. That opens the possibility that a minority can block change. So the first notion of minority rights is the notion that there are some very important questions where we insist that the majority be a huge majority, that they build the consensus before they can prevail. And we seek in that way to protect minority rights. But the minority rights that we're protecting there are only the minority rights to block change. The minority doesn't get a right to impose its will on the majority. No, they just simply take an existing situation in which a majority would like to make a change, and the minority says you can't make that change unless you get a great big giant minority to do so. Probably the most important case in which we have a critical minority right is when it comes to amending the Constitution itself. The Constitution was written in the summer of 1787 by a convention held in Philadelphia. It was ratified by the necessary number of states, and it only required 9 of the 13 states to ratify it, to put it into effect. It was put into effect early in 1789. From that time forward, we've had that Constitution. But the framers of the Constitution knew that the language they used in 1787 or 1789 would be outdated and changes would be necessary. So they made a provision for amending the Constitution to put new language in the Constitution that would allow the people of a country to change the Constitution and put new passages in the Constitution that would have the full force of the Constitution behind it. But in order to do that, they weren't going to have some narrow, temporary majority make the change. Instead, they insisted that to change the Constitution, they would have to have either conventions or calls for an amendment by 60% of the states. That's a provision we've never used. Or the more likely and more commonly used, and in fact the only used today, so far today, is a provision that the House of Representatives by a two-thirds vote and the Senate by a two-thirds vote propose a proposed constitutional amendment. Because it already has a two-thirds vote, it doesn't need the President's approval. It just simply goes to the states. When it goes to the states, in order for it to take effect, it must have the support of 3/4 of the states. And to get the support of any one state, it has to have, if that state has 2 houses to its legislature, it has to have both houses vote to approve and ratify the constitutional amendment. The Constitution has been amended, but not very often. Actually, if you look at the Constitution, they've had 27 amendments. 10 of them, though, were amended at the very beginning in the Bill of Rights. So actually, if we consider those 10 amendments just one amendment, which would be reasonable, we're down to 17. And then, of course, among the 17 is an amendment that we put in the Constitution that we then took out of the Constitution. So we really only amended the Constitution about 15 times in 230 years. Why don't we do it more often? Well, it's very hard to amend the Constitution. It requires a large majority in Congress, both houses of Congress simultaneously, and then it requires the approval of 3/4 of the states. Now this last requirement, 3/4 of the states, is really onerous. For example, if there were a constitutional amendment that sought to disadvantage the smallest states, for example, an amendment that would say that each state would have a number of senators in proportion to its population, which would give a big boost of senators to California, New York, and Texas, but would diminish the voting power of a state like Wyoming, the smallest of our states, to having just 2. That sort of amendment would run afoul of all of the smaller states. How many smaller states would it take to block? Well, 3/4 of 50 states is 37 3/4, so you round it up to 38. You have to have 38 states to approve it. That means that 13 states could block it. How big are those 13 states? Well, if you counted up the population in the smallest 13 states, you discover that only about 2 to 3% of the entire population of the United States lives in the smallest 13 states. And only half of them are necessary to elect the legislature. So if you had an amendment that was offensive to the smallest states, you'd have to have 98% of the American people in favor of it before it could even pass. That's no easy task. Not every constitutional amendment impinges on the big state, small state question, so it's possible to pass constitutional amendments, and we have done so, but not very often. Now, let's look at this question of minority rights again. Number one, minority rights are not a reference to groups, although I know it's commonly used for everything under the sun. Minority means a minority on any political question where the people voting on a question have less than 50% plus 1. That's it. Those provisions are put in the Constitution in order to minimize violence, because we recognize if you used only majority rule and a majority ran roughshod over a minority, the minority would fight back and violence would be the result, and that would defeat the purpose of government altogether. The minority does not have a right to impose its will on the majority. It can only block change. Is there a proposed new treaty that's going to change the status of the United States with regard to other countries? So a change in that status requires the President to negotiate the treaty, but the ratification by 2/3 of the Senate. That allows a minority of 1/3 plus 1 to block change. Is there a proposed change in the Constitution? Well, that means that the existing Constitution is in effect and covers everybody. Somebody wants to change that. They have to persuade not just 50% plus 1, but a vastly greater majority in order to overcome the rights of the minority to block change. Now, so far I've discussed all of this in terms of groups, in terms of political techniques. But there's another issue here. Why do we have a Constitution? Well, we don't have a Constitution simply to create powers. I suppose the Constitution does that. But the acid test of a Constitution is its ability to protect each individual right. A minority of 1. So included among the constitutional protections are not just group rights, small states versus big groups versus small groups. Actually, the purpose of the Constitution is to protect, in certain critical sense, human rights or individual civil rights that belong to each of us as an individual, which would mean as an individual we could stand up to the entire nation of 308 million people. a remarkable concept.